Hills.
Watch complete election night coverage from News Center 8. We're proud to be your news.
This is CBS News, continuing coverage of Campaign 88, Election Night. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening and thanks for being with us. Headline, George Bush is sweeping through the South like a tornado through a trailer park. He is out of the starting gate very fast where he was expected to be in Deep Dixie. Our CBS News coverage of Election Night 1988 is underway, a night to watch to see if Michael Dukakis will confound the polls, and the pros and pull off the ultimate Massachusetts miracle, winning the presidency. Or does George Bush win by landslide proportions, a blowout so big that he does what's now considered remote but possible, put the United States Senate back in Republican hands. So with that in mind, let's look them over. Keep in mind the polls have just closed in some more states here in the East, but as we came up to the 7 o'clock time, this is the way our CBS News estimate map looked. Our CBS News had estimated that George Bush, when all the votes were in and counted, would have carried both Kentucky and Indiana, the two states where the polls closed at 6 o'clock in the Eastern time zone. Now, at 7 p.m., the polls closed in another 6 states with 60 electoral votes. Our CBS News estimates are that when all is said and done, George Bush will have won at least 5. Bush's states turn red on our map. Dukakis, winning if he gets any, turn blue. The states where the polls have closed, but we do not yet have a decision, remain in white. You see Vermont up there, but keep in mind that the state of Vermont has gone to the Republicans in every presidential election in 134 years, except for Lyndon Johnson's earth slide in 1964. Now the close-ups in Florida. Where the flamingos often fly, George Bush takes off. As expected, he gets Florida's 21 electoral votes. At one time, Dukakis thought he could carry that state, but it turns out not to be. In Georgia, Bush has cut through Dukakis' hopes like a jackknife through peaches. Bush gets 12 electoral votes in Georgia. On up the eastern seaboard, in the Old Dominion state. In Virginia, where tobacco and Republicans generally do well, Bush does well, gets Virginia's 12 electoral votes. In South Carolina, the Palmetto State and the home of one of Bush's campaign managers, 8 electoral votes goes to George Bush as expected. All of this was predicted well in advance, but it shows you what's developing on the evening. More about that later. In New Hampshire, which may have saved the Bush nomination in the primary and caucus season, Bush expected to get the granted states 4 electoral votes, and he does in New Hampshire. We don't have a decision yet in Vermont that we're prepared to talk about, but as we said, Vermont nearly always goes Republican. Needed to win 270 electoral college votes. Bush already, by our estimate, has 78. Dukakis has none. In the votes actually in and tabulated, as you would expect at this early hour, only about 1% of the precincts reporting. The margins look something like this. Now, if those margins stayed that way, it would be an absolute teetotal, mortal blowout for George Bush, but they are expected to close down as the evening goes along. Looking very quickly now at some of the Senate races. Remember that as we started the evening, there were 54-46 Democrats over the Republicans in the United States Senate. 33 big Senate seats up today. And one of the questions we'll be looking at as the night goes along, if George Bush wins by the margin expected, does he have coattails? Is it possible? Could he pull in a Republican Senate majority with him? With that in mind, let's take a look at how the Senate races are going in some of the states where we have the polls closing already. Well, as it turns out, in Virginia, the Old Dominion state, remember, we just reported to you a few moments ago, our CBS News estimate was that Bush had carried Virginia, but Chuck Robb, the former governor, son-in-law of LBJ, holds on, this is actual pickup seat, picks run against Robb, beats back the challenge of Maurice Dawkins, a conservative black civil rights activist and Baptist minister. So a pickup for the Democrats in the Senate in Virginia. In Vermont, our CBS News estimate is, when all the votes are counted there, that Representative Jim Jeffords, a Republican, will hold on to this Republican Senate seat in Vermont. Our estimate is that Jeffords will beat Bill Gray, who has run a strong campaign but not strong enough. Now, George Bush, as we said, out of the blocks about as fast as Flojo, our great runner in the Olympics. But as expected, he carried Florida, he carried South Carolina, he carried Georgia. You saw those states. So how could Dukakis possibly win? Well, no one's saying Dukakis will win, but this is what Mike Dukakis and his staff thinks. They're trying to pull off the same sort of thing that Harry Truman did in 1948, and they have targeted an 18-state strategy. Now, these are the 18 states we show you on our map here that Michael Dukakis figures he can get blown out by George Bush in the South, in the Rocky Mountain states, but that if he can win in these 18 states, he will have a chance. Now, the only one of those states that has so far been in our CBS estimates called, well, as a matter of fact, none of them. We were going to say Vermont, but we have not yet called Vermont as yet. So, Bruce Morton, the 18-state strategy for Dukakis, at least right now, just past 7 o'clock in the East, is still alive. Of the 18, what 3 would he consider most critical?
He'd consider all 18 most critical, and he has nowhere to go if he starts to lose in those 18 states. And the reason is, you can see in the southern states you just called, what used to be the Democratic South, what lately has been the Republican South, George Bush just sweeping across. So Ronald Reagan got 61% of the white Southern vote against Southerner Jimmy Carter in 1980, 71% against Walter Mondale 4 years ago. Bush is getting 66% of the white Southern vote today against Michael Dukakis. The last Democrat to carry the white South was Lyndon Johnson almost a quarter of a century ago, and that's why Michael Dukakis needs all 18 of those non-Southern states.
Well, Bruce, we have the polls close in Ohio in about 25 minutes. Ohio is on Michael Dukakis's 18-state strategy map, so that will be what we can look forward to, building the drama of the evening. If Dukakis is to have any chance, he probably has to carry Ohio or upset in some big state such as Texas to offset it.
If he loses Ohio, he's in big trouble.
On the Republican side, the Bush campaign will be looking at a foundation they've built over the last 5 presidential elections. 23 states with 202 electoral votes. This is what the Republicans like to call their lock. We put a question mark after it. The GOP has won 5 times in a row these states. You only need 270 electoral votes to win. There are 202 in the states you see blocked in white there. Don't forget that Bush is also expected to do this time around very well in the South. So, Bob Schieffer, you covered the Bush campaign for those many months. If they had to pick 3 states out of their 23 that they're most worried about, what might they be?
Oh, I think the ones they might be most worried about would be Illinois and California. But the Bush strategy is very much to start about South Carolina, and if you think you've heard this before, you have, because it's the strategy that Ronald Reagan used twice. Start about South Carolina, head across the South, get down to about Arizona, make a hard right up the Rockies. And the Bush people think that if they could sweep the South and take the Rockies, then if they get Ohio and New Jersey, they have won the election. So I suppose the states that they would be watching most closely tonight are Ohio and New Jersey, because if they get them, I think they can win this election without California and without Illinois.
Thanks, Bob. Diane Sawyer has been analyzing the results of today's CBS News, New York Times national poll. These are questions that we ask of the voters as they left the polling places. Diane, what's the #1 issue on the voters' minds today?
Well, I'll tell you, Dan, backed by popular demand, the #1 hit on the voter hit parade is what it's been before, the economy. Now, sometimes that hit is a drumbeat for change, but take a look at this year. You'll see that in our poll, 51%, and we just lost part of our apparatus here, I think we're still in business, 51% of those citing the economy say the economy is getting better, so you can take your clue from there. Now, here's another footnote, a kind of headline for you. Half again as many voters as have ever told us this before said they went into that voting booth and voted because of the vice presidency. It may be not enough to tip the election one way or the other, but it's a clear indication that the new president better take heed, whoever he is, that the vice presidency is of more concern to voters this year than we've seen since our exit polling began. Dan?
Thanks, Diane. Good to have you with us. Ed Bradley has spent most of the day talking to voters, not looking at polls, but talking to actual voters. Ed, among other things, what did you hear?
Dan, a couple of things jumped out right away at me. One is that I didn't find a lot of people who felt passionately about the man they cast their ballot for. And this fell on both sides. I didn't find enthusiastic Bush supporters or enthusiastic Dukakis supporters. One man told me he voted for the lesser of 2 evils. The other thing that became apparent very early this morning is that people were really concerned about the process. A lot of people said they felt the campaign was too long, it was too negative, and not enough of the issues were covered.
Thanks, Ed. And we'll be coming back to you very shortly.